Okay. Next up, we have two short papers to present work in progress. Of course, everything is work in progress. But Mollie Dollinger from University of Melbourne, presenting on behalf of herself and Jason Lodge on co-creation strategies for learning analytics. Thank you, Mollie.
Thanks, Simon. Just when you were finally going to get to hear from an Australian, another American. Sorry to disappoint you. So just to echo what the keynote said earlier today, I think we were in a period of data drought. Now we have access to all this new types of data, and we were sort of applying it and playing around with it haphazardly, and now it's sort of time to start to think about what solutions we can really start to solve with our data. So to reflect on the theme, again, a lot of people have mentioned already that user-centered is really where our headspaces should be at today. And by users, we of course don't just mean researchers and teachers and administrators, but we also mean students. But what I really like about this conference title also is the fact that we use the word towards, because while we've seen two really great examples already today in this session, we're not quite there yet, and there are still so many different investigations and things that we need to explore as far as involving everyone in the process. So when I tell people I study co-creation, they often think I mean creationism. I do not study creationism, but I do study co-creation. And co-creation arises from the 1970s, actually. It started with participatory frameworks. And nowadays it's old hat, but at the time, the idea of involving users in our ideas of how to produce things was pretty new and different. And of course, you're probably all familiar with the term market research, but co-creation is a far more complex thing than that. I like to define co-creation as an interaction between two distinct stakeholders or more to integrate their respective resources. So that's not saying that they have the same resources, but it is acknowledging the fact that everyone is bringing something to the table. So this would require a change in definition of learning analytics itself. So you're probably all familiar with this definition. It's very widely used. The only issue I have with this definition, however, is the about learners. I think moving forward, and this conference certainly will help do this, is we need to change it to with learners, because learning analytics, given that it is an especially expert-driven field, is particularly susceptible to not actually meeting the needs of its users. And that can only get worse unless we start to integrate users into the process. So some of the key principles of co-creation are access, obviously letting people first become a part of the design and the production of learning analytics. Transparency, because if you don't know the constraints of the project, even the budget and the timeline, your users are not going to make very useful contributions. Continuous dialogue, so it's not a one-off. I often get people say to me, well, I do feedback surveys. I'm like, well, that's not co-creation, that's just a one-off thing. Co-creation is really bringing people involved into the process. So that's sharing the responsibility and roles. It means sort of stopping the idea of that researchers control everything, letting teachers and students have some control. And of course, all of that is underpinned, very importantly, by commitment, which has to be ongoing and authentic. You actually have to be willing to change based on what your users are going to tell you. So in the paper, which you're more than welcome to read for more, I talk about how co-creation meets learning analytics. So why should we integrate co-creation into learning analytics? I can go through these a little bit real quickly right now, but most of them you're probably already familiar with. So there's a mismatch currently between design and capacity. We've seen that before. Teachers don't know how to use the platform. They're not, the keynote today and so on. We joked about how teachers don't understand simple statistics. Well, that might be funny, but your platform's not going to go very far unless teachers understand it. Invalid inferences, and making sure that we really are understanding what results are coming back. And all of this also reconceptualizing learning analytics from a product to a service. It's an ongoing, dynamic field that we build, we create value together over time. So hopefully I have you convinced that yes, you think learning analytics should have some, should have some co-creation or some participatory frameworks to it. So how can you apply it to whatever projects you're currently working on at your own institutions? Well, the first thing you can start to do is start to understand the values and the goals of all the people involved. And they don't always necessarily meet your own, and that's important. And it's also important to distinguish between expectations and needs. So just to illustrate this, you can see here these are often different issues that students and teachers and researchers are all thinking. So for example, students may want to know, how hard will the test be? Well, do we have learning analytics that can show them how hard the test will be? Will it help them study more? I don't know. Meanwhile, researchers perhaps are thinking more, how do we improve engagement? So obviously, these are coming at different things from different angles, and so addressing the goals really helps. The second thing we can start to do is be inclusive. So this is a very hot topic because we've had a couple different sessions now say, should we really show teachers and students, all of the things that we're collecting? And maybe not. I don't have the answer to that. But these are definitely questions that have to be addressed, so using lead users or all users. And also research and co-creation in industry has shown that co-creation works best when it's integrated slowly. So if you're going to start to use it, maybe start off with one or two aspects of co-creation, see how they go, and then so on. I'm not necessarily advocating full-blown, co-creation right away. The third thing to keep in mind is power balance. So there are definitely challenges working with teachers and students because of the different ways that we think. But it is important to recognize that students are experts at being students, which is something researchers definitely are not. So how can you utilize that specific expertise and tap into that knowledge pool to improve what you're going to accomplish? And then the fourth and final one is, of course, context, so important. What are the parameters of your study? And how do you support ongoing motivation of your participants? So in an ideal world, we could pay everyone to constantly be involved in our studies and so on, but that's not really realistic in the higher education climate specifically. So we need to support intrinsic motivation. And research shows that people are motivated to participate just by having their voices heard and feeling like it's actually authentic. So how do we do that? So a summary of some of the considerations. I unfortunately do not have time to go into all of them in this presentation. You can read more in the paper. But there are considerations both before you begin your interventions and during. And of course, after. This is all an add-on effect. It's a cycle. And you learn something every time. And the main thing to stress is that there's no necessarily right or wrong way to start involving users into your design process, but it is important to begin trial and error. But of course, have I problematized learning analytics enough? Before I get to Rosie, I would be amiss not to point out all the very large challenges that come to a co-creation design. The first one, of course, being time. It takes time to think about what you're going to do, and it takes probably extra time in your project to then hear from other stakeholders. Co-creation often benefits from previous experiences, but maybe you don't have any previous experiences, and maybe your users don't. And that's something that can only be accomplished through several rounds. Scalability, we have no idea how scalable co-creation really is. It does seem to be that the more users you integrate, the less deep, rich opinions you can necessarily tap into. And of course, opposing mindsets. I've presented co-creation at many conferences, and there are some people who really just don't think that students should tell us how to teach, and that's going to be something that we would all struggle with. But I think it's worth it because, as Simon pointed out, we need to make sure that learning analytics is really solving the problems that we need solved most. And the fact is user preferences are changing, and people do want to be involved in the process, and they do want transparency. So if we're going to continue learning analytics, we need to allow for that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Molly, for setting out the challenge. Who would like to respond? One at the back here.
Thanks, Molly. I liked your thing about the students being experts, but of course they haven't completed the final assessment yet. So there's the castor oil problem, isn't there? So how do you balance that between an academic who's been through it and a student who hasn't yet?
Yeah, well, but I mean, that's part of the thing. When you have been through the process, then you know sort of the end of it, and you don't necessarily remember what it's like to not know that. It's sort of hard to unknow. So students can complement that by really reminding you, oh, this is what I really struggle with, or this isn't working for me, and then you can be like, oh yeah, I remember. Actually, that happened to me as well. So, experts in different ways.
Okay. More questions? I'm not seeing a hand. Okay, Molly, since I champion user-centered design, I'm going to really disagree with you now.
Okay.
Just for fun, okay? It's actually what the last question was, right? Students are experts in their own learning, if I quote the slide right, or something to that effect, right?
Yes.
Now, let me put it to you that compared to many other sectors where we do user-centered design and we consider users to be experts in their work, and what they say about how they do their work and how it needs to be done, etc., is authoritative. Is that different in education because students often have incredibly naive understandings about what good learning will look like?
Yes, I agree that it can definitely look different in education. I think the problem is made worse by the fact that as educators, especially higher education, which is my area, I'm not K through 12, that we can be more transparent. We can, I don't think educators do enough to point out, this is what I want you to learn by the end of it. This is why it's so important. And then to see how learners accept that and how they grapple with it in their own ways. But yeah, I mean, of course, learners don't know the expertise that you know. They only know what it's like to be a student in the class. Anything else? All right.
Okay. Down to Ken.
Yes, I guess you raised some interesting issues on, I think, the slide right before this when you were raising challenges. Just wondering if you have any other thoughts on the trade-off between scalability and really getting rich contextual insights through a co-creation process.
Yeah, I mean, this is why people advocate for lead users. So the Students as Partners movement, which is quite popular in the US specifically, has students accompany each teacher into the classroom and sort of reflect on how the teaching and the classroom activity went from a student perspective. But they do this just with one trained student partner. And yeah, moving forward, that might be the better way to go, having a lead user as opposed to having everyone have a stake. Also, something to be a little bit wary of is in Students as Partners and co-creation research, we find that once a student has stepped outside their normal role, they become a lot more critical of everything. Yeah, so it's a little bit like once you pull away the curtain, then what happens? I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One at the back there. Carlos, thanks.
Molly, I really enjoyed your talk. So this is bouncing off of some of the questions that other people brought up with co-creation and students and who's an expert, because I've gone into the classroom and I've shown students data about, for example, taking notes on laptops or active learning, and they look at me and say, will you just lecture and let me take notes on my laptop? I don't care what the research says. So there's the student perspective on how do I learn, the student perspective on, okay, well, I'm a biology teacher, so I need to deliver biology content, which is different from learning. So is co-creation appropriate, do you think, in some aspects or in all aspects? So what I'm getting at is that sometimes the students just don't care what you say, even if it's in their best interest, but maybe sometimes there is a good example. So could you comment on how universal you think co-creation is?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to is user preferences, and not every user has the same preference. There will definitely be students where you say, come, I'll let you in, I'll open up the curtain, we can work together, I'll design a dashboard just for you, and they're just gonna say, no, you know what, no thanks, I'm not interested in that. And that's just part of the reality of any intervention that we do, that some students are not interested in sort of that extra, additional thing. And I do think co-creation is for some more so than for others, but I also think that there's sort of an ongoing issue where maybe students have, historically always felt a little bit passive. They don't know how to be active learners by the time we get them in higher education. And that's maybe something that needs to be addressed earlier on in their education.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Mollie. And let's thank her one more time.